we playfully call this the Wooniverse, right? Inside the Wooniverse, which is why I loved your book, Why Woo Woo Works. I mean, it's like my favorite book. But, the idea that this is woo woo because people are still very much engaged in the idea of separation, right? And that's nobody's fault. We physically see this, you're over there, I'm over here, blah, blah, blah. And we don't recognize this invisible field, which is what I want to talk about, this field in which we're entangled. Let's talk about that now.
Yeah, so for me in the book, I argue that consciousness is the basis of reality, and we are therefore all connected through a field of consciousness. And although it might sound odd for a scientist to say that, given physics isn't really interested at the moment in that kind of stuff, but a lot of the research in the field of psi, PSI, it's like an umbrella term for ESP, parapsychology, presentiment, all prayer, distant healing, all these kind of things. For me, there's no question that there's a real psi effect, right? And I know that in the mainstream of science, we tend to be dismissive of that. And the people that are dismissive of it, most of them, it's not because you're experts in it and you know whether that's true or not. It just doesn't sound plausible, and it can't really be plausible if we accept the mainstream notion that consciousness is produced by your brain, or it's an illusion. You're in the mainstream. There are a lot of psychologists, physicists, every field of science believe that consciousness is just an illusion, or that it's produced by chemistry in the brain. And if you follow that path, then it can't possibly be a psi effect. So I believe, given the data, there's no question for me and people researching in the field that there's a psi effect. So therefore, I think we have to move away from that idea that consciousness is produced by the brain. So given the main ideas, we're only left with two options based on the main philosophies. And one is something called panpsychism, the idea that particles have consciousness. And I'm not suggesting that an atom in my couch sits back and enjoys watching Netflix on a Friday night. But the more rudimentary you go, everything has experience. If you write down to the smallest things, the smallest things we know of are called quarks and electrons. They're the most fundamental particles. A proton is just two up quarks and a down quark. So the most fundamental is a quark. And researchers now, physicists, if they're really honest, will say, well, we don't really know what a quark is. All we can do is refer to the equations that they satisfy. In other words, physics can tell us, and I know this because I'm, in the 5th of 6th years of a formal academic degree in physics and mathematics, just out of curiosity. And the best we know at the moment is we can tell you what a quark does, but we don't know what it is.
Right.
And it's the same. And if you scale that idea up, what we end up with in philosophy is what's called the hard problem of consciousness. We know what consciousness does. So we know what the brain or consciousness does, but we don't know what it is. So
right.
We know that there's something there, but we don't know what it's like to have we can't explain what it's like to have an experience. We can just say what the brain is doing while I have an experience, but that's not the same as having the actual experience. So it's called the hard problem of consciousness. So panpsychism attempts to solve that. But the other one that attempts to solve it is called idealism, and it's the idea that a field of consciousness is actually the foundation of all of reality. And this is very consistent with the Eastern ideas of non-duality and stuff. And I argued in the book that idealism or panpsychism or something in between the two, for me, is the foundation of reality. And therefore it means that everything is consciousness, and therefore everything is connected or entangled, if you will, through consciousness. And I would even argue, although, most physicists would disagree, but I would argue that maybe many of the phenomena we see in the physical world are really just mirrors of the same sort of phenomena that we see in consciousness. For example, entanglement, the fact that it exists as a physical phenomena. If you can take two particles, separate them by, trillions of miles, and you can ping one of them, and immediately the state of the other one is correlated with it. You can't send information from one to the other, but they are the state is connected. They're entangled. And I think that's a mirror of, if you accept the idea that consciousness is the basis of reality, then that is really just a mirror of something the same, something similar in consciousness. In other words, we're already connected in consciousness. And I think that's why things like prayer and distant healing work. And that's why I believe there's an effect of psi, because everything is already connected. And
Yeah.
I argued in the book that the strength of connection increases when you feel love or empathy or emotional warmth. And that seems to be what some of the research shows. Studies in Psi that allow, where the protocol of the study allows for people to generate an emotional connection, the Psi effect is always stronger than if the protocol takes out the emotional connection altogether. Because in science, we're overly trying to understand it, so we're making it too clinical. So what we often do is take out emotional connection because we think it's all about intention. And what happens is there are very weak or no Psi effect sometimes. And the strongest effects are when we feel warmth, empathy, love, compassion, some form of felt connection. And so I would say that is the formula, if you will, that underlies impacting things at a distance, impacting life, impacting the world, is having a sense of warmth and felt connection with each other, with things. And that's when you begin to see this kind of effect.
Okay, if you like this podcast and you want to see more, just click over here and you'll get to see more clips from this interview. If you just want to listen, well, if you click there, you'll listen to the entire interview, available to you on any one of your favorite podcast channels.